Yo, what's up, gamers? Aaron Shack here, and we are live on Shackcast episode 72, where we will be talking about Superman, the movie 2025. I'm very excited to be talking about this. Just a quick disclaimer as we will be filming this live. I won't be looking at the comments until the end, just to stay focused and to stay on point. Because if I look at like something off to the side, off the screen, it is very possible that I will entirely lose my train of thought, and then I probably won't get it back, or people will ask questions about things I've already talked about earlier in the episode, or they might ask about something that happens later in the movie, and I'm like, my mind isn't to that point yet, and I'm trying to keep a few things chronological. So we're going to try to do our best with that. And then I'm also, for those of you watching on YouTube, I'm going to try to have a couple visual assets here and there, just to sort of go with the flow of conversation. We'll have a couple things on screen for like notable scenes. It should go without saying that we're going to get into some spoilers and stuff like that. So if you don't want the movie spoiled, just tune into this later. I think it's perfectly acceptable. Like, watch the movie and come check out this podcast episode later. You can find it anywhere you get your podcasts, in audio format, and also you can catch us on YouTube. Sometimes episodes are live, sometimes they're pre-recorded, but I know some people might have some questions, so I figured, like, hey, at the end we can just compile all that together and have a little Q&A at the end. So it'll be nice. But overall, we're going to talk about Superman 2025 and what I think, as someone who is a huge fan of the character. I've enjoyed the movies, the TV shows, the comics, the action figures, the video games, you name it. I am extremely fascinated and knowledgeable of the character, and, despite really enjoying what Snyder was putting together with Henry Cavill and feeling like they kind of got screwed over by, execs and producers and stuff like that, more execs, I guess I would say, that vision was growing into something, whereas this movie, getting to my first point, this movie, starts without an origin story. It feels like we're starting in the third movie of a series that we're already like familiar with some of the base characters, whether it's, Lois, Clark, Superman, Lex, like even the more niche characters like the robots and Ultraman and Guy Gardner, like really pulling from stuff that like most moviegoers who are not comic fans or not deeply knowledgeable of the characters might be unfamiliar with, but to where comic book fans who are familiar with a lot of these characters will be like, oh my gosh, this is the first time, like, outside of animated universes, we're seeing Guy Gardner in live action, we're seeing other characters and stuff, outside of, maybe CW TV has covered, some of that ground as well. So we're already deep in the Superman lore and characters that comic book fans would be familiar with. Of course, the movie starts out with Superman losing a battle and Krypto comes to the rescue. And I think one of the things that I want to praise about Krypto, I was kind of concerned. I was like, okay, well, once you start bringing in the super family and all the different, things get a little wacky and a little weird, and, it ends up not being a solo Superman project that is, about the character development of him. And you also get into a risky space that the CW TV shows kind of got into, where it was like, oh, all of a sudden, like, Arrow could no longer operate on his own. The Flash could no longer operate on his own, despite being really smart and super fast and stuff like that. It all of a sudden became more about the team and less about, like, the character. And so the character doesn't have much individual growth because it becomes a team show, and it becomes about all the problems of the cast and working together, and he starts to heavily rely on teammates instead of realizing, like, I'm a superpowered metahuman. I'm really smart and powerful, and I can handle a lot of things on my own, but there might be a few things here and there that are going to be out of my depth, or I'm way over here fighting this, and someone else needs to be over here diffusing the bombs or whatever, right? So one thing I want to praise about Crypto is I think how he was handled. A mix of live action scenes of him like standing there and being cute and playful and wagging his tail and laying on Superman's chest and stuff like that. And then we also had those moments where he's delivering like super pounces and flying around and super dashing through the snow to come drag Superman home to the Fortress of Solitude, which also gets like no introduction. Like it really just sort of, it just shows up and you're just like, yeah, you should know this. So I mean, for people like me and for comic book fans, I think it's pretty easy to stay up to par with that. And I think some of the critiques that I saw was that this movie was like had like a plot that was like difficult to follow, and I can't see how that's possible, because I feel like one scene flows into the next and it's all very logical, and it doesn't feel like we're doing weird time skips back and forth, or that it's doing like a bunch of like side jokes and constantly swapping between scenes or making anything terribly confusing. I think it's a forward moving movie, as most Superman movies are. They tend to move that way. So I think the good mix of like not having Crypto just be 100% CGI, because I think then you sort of lose that like real world connection to the character, especially as CGI begins to age and it starts to become more difficult to tell, or you start to realize that, yeah, it really is just an animation. I think my biggest example that I bring forward is Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, how like literally all the stunts, all the elements of action, like it's all CG. And so when you go back and watch that movie, it feels like there's no stakes. And so, years from now when we go back and watch this, we'll be able to look at Crypto, and sure, maybe some of the CGI will have aged and we'll be like, oh, we can tell. But usually in the moment it becomes difficult to tell, and I think that's a good thing. But also, it's good to have those like real moments where he stands in there and holds his own. So I think Crypto was handled really well. He was super cute. I think captured very accurately as a little bit of a menace, a little bit of a bad dog. Now, as you can see on screen, you can see the suit, which is a little weird, where they kind of decided to go in a lot of different directions at once. We can see like the high collar, which a lot of people complain about, especially during the New 52 era. They were like, oh, well, how does he hide that under his suit, under his dress shirt and stuff like that? Like the collar would be visible, but also the suit had sort of a biometric system, and it would biologically form to him, so kind of like nanomachines, but also not really, because it would just form when he needed it. So like he would rip the shirt and then the suit would start filling in, and it would be very easy. He wouldn't have to worry about stuff like that. But then you have like the Kingdom Come S shield, which I don't know what that could, that could build into that at some point. It could be possible that they want to have this universe hang around long enough, or change the casting at some point and have Old Man Soups and Kingdom Come Batman and all the good stuff. But then they also did some other things. Like it's got a lot of the line work around the shoulders and the bracers, and I believe on the legs a little bit that you see in the New 52. But then you have like the classic belt and trunks, which it's all very mishmash. Which, like, I'm not even saying it's like bad. It's just different. And I'm surprised he went with New 52, which is something I like. But I think in this case, I think the suit doesn't allow his muscles to show. It's a little too thick material and padded, and it's not as skin tight, and it also doesn't have sort of the color that accents the muscles, because we do know that David got really ripped for this role. Granted, he's not Henry Cavill big, but he's still big. He's still really big. And I feel like the suit doesn't showcase that. And that's something that you really see in the comics and even in the movies and even in TV shows and stuff. They tend to, the modern way is to sort of go these suits that really accentuate the fact that, yes, he's big and buff, but also, the bright colors and everything accentuates that he's a friendly presence and a good guy. And I think David was saying the reason for the trunks was, to relate to children, to make him look kind of silly and goofy and be like, yeah, this is not some alien that you're going to be afraid of, perhaps, right? But, I mean, and comic book artists and creators and stuff have made reference to that, but it also goes back to the classic depiction of these superheroes in the 1930s and 40s as being like gymnasts and circus acts and stuff like that, where they would wear these tight suits and the wrestler outfits of like the underwear over the pants and stuff like that. And so it was a way to accentuate muscles and to accentuate, the perfect form of the body and depict, all of these different heroes and such as strong men and women, of course. So there's that. But I think the things, they didn't have the red lining on the collar or the bracers, which I think is a really nice touch, but, they didn't really fully embrace that, or the more subtle belt or different colors. They went classic belt. So they did that. But yeah, I mean, it's, those are like my critiques of the suit, but I don't think it's like bad. It's just, it's different. And in the modern age, we have a lot of, we have a little bit of both in the comics, where there are times where he's without the briefs, and there are times where he has the trunks again. And it kind of works either way. It's kind of just artist choice, and sometimes maybe it depends on the story, who's telling it. So, moving on, the robots in the Fortress of Solitude were reminiscent of All-Star Superman comics, which I was kind of worried when James Gunn was saying that he was going to create a story about Legacy based around All-Star Superman, because, number one, like, art style-wise, it's just not my favorite, and I think the comic itself, and even the animated show they did of it, which I thought was cool, it's kind of a hard read. It's really rough, because it's about Superman getting too much radiation exposure by getting too close to the sun, and essentially giving himself radiation poisoning that he could not recover from. So it was kind of a weird Death of Superman type of story, and I just didn't like it very much. So I was a little worried, but I do think that, having the robots and, they show up in comics, and, he always has, some sort of interface set up with the Fortress of Solitude as, some sort of guidance from either his parents, leftover crystals from Krypton, that type of way of communicating with his past, and using the vast library of Krypton as, sort of a reference of whatever threats he might be facing from all over the galaxy. Usually the Fortress of Solitude is a place of knowledge and learning, and also, as he hints in the movie, he wanted to find a way to capture the kaiju and preserve it, and perhaps euthanize it in a safe and humane manner. And there is a pretty big history in the fortress of him, sort of collecting various aliens and animals and stuff to keep them in a safe place where they won't do harm to others and things like that. Sort of an ethical way. Um, I also think very early on in the movie he saves the falafel guy, which is a very important part of the movie. Um, and then also I just want to talk about some of the cast at the Daily Planet. I think they did a really good job casting, of course, Lois and Clark, but I think Perry and Jimmy and Steve, over at the sports desk. And also, we didn't really get a whole lot of Cat Grant, but I think if you know the characters, you're like, oh, that's Cat, that's Steve. But because they didn't spend much time really even introducing Perry, they just kind of assumed that you would just know because he's got like the vest and the cigar, and he doesn't even have a whole lot of dialogue in the movie, which I thought was very strange. Even at the point where they sort of present him the case of everything that's happening, and then that article gets approved at the end of the movie. But I think this gets into some other things. But I want to do just the quickest break here, because what was really cool was our local comic book store, Star Comics, was there at the movie theater, both before and after the movie, selling comics and action figures and prints and graphic novels. And it was all like Superman and Super Family focused. And so I wanted to show a few things that are in my collection because I was at Alamo Drafthouse. And we got to watch some of the classic Fleischer animations from 1940, right? Classic 40s comics. And this is the one where, he's got like the classic black shield with the red S and the gold trim. And of course he has like kind of the squinty eyes that he always has in that. And it's really cool. So I've already had this for a while, but I want to kind of show you what they had at the movie theater. They had one of my favorite artists that does comic books is Alex Ross, and they had Superman from the pages of Justice, which is a really good like Justice League type of storyline. And then of course later on you can read like Kingdom Come, which I think really leads into it. But apparently in this line, there's series 1, which is Bizarro, Sinestro, Superman, Cheetah, and Flash. And then series 2 has Batman, Black Canary, Black Manta, Aquaman, Parasite, and it goes from there. But sadly, this was all they had. But like this is the one to get because I think it's a really good art style and a really, like hyper realistic depiction of our heroes. Now, what I did grab from the comic book store was this one from the movie, which has alternate faces for Superman, different expressions, ranging from just kind of default to anger to the laser eyes, and then you got the flying hands, and you also got fists and stuff. And then you have a little crypto figurine right there, and of course a little bit of art on the back. They also have one without it, but this is the deluxe edition that comes with crypto. And this is what I picked up at the movie theater, was Lex, and he has like kind of a smirky grin, and then he's got like an upset face as well. And he's got like fists and sort of a pointing or trigger finger style look. And then also there's like a mini version of the kaiju guy when he first sets him loose, and then he gradually starts to grow, which we'll talk about more as we sort of discuss my review of the film a little more. But this was super cool because I was really wanting a Lex figure, and he's wearing more of a purple suit, but I mean it's kind of more in line with a lot of his depictions in the comics. Whereas in the movie, I think it's more of a black suit. Just depending on what he's wearing and what scene, he changes a little bit throughout the movie. But yeah, I think this was really cool, and it was super dope seeing a local business there able to support and just be part of the community instead of it just being like the theater handing out free posters or just selling T-shirts or something, which would have been good too. And there were definitely some people wearing T-shirts, and I'm surprised there wasn't anyone cosplaying. I didn't want to. I was like, it's too hot. It's too hot in summer in Texas, and I'm gonna eat like pizza and like spill the grease all over it. No, no thanks. But yeah, really cool, really interesting. So let's keep going as we talk more and more about that. But I wanted to stop and just highlight that because I thought it was a really cool. Okay, we can do that. So yeah, ethics of Clark interviewing Superman. I thought this was a really interesting part of the movie where Clark and Lois meet up at home, and Clark reveals that he sort of interviews himself as Superman, and in that way, he's able to get all these scoops and to have the perfect questions and answers. And then Lois sort of points out the ethical dilemma of doing something like that, and that essentially she challenges him that he should be willing to take actual questioning from a journalist, someone that's not him, that's gonna ask questions that are not biased and stuff like that. And even though she knows things that she's not supposed to know because she dates Superman, she was still able to ask questions that led somewhere. And I thought that was an interesting scene, and it was kind of funny. But I also think there was a little too much cussing from Superman. I'm not going to be weird and like complain about it, but I just want to point out that like even though this is a show that adults and teenagers can enjoy as well, it's very much a show where this is going to be kids' first experience with Superman. If he's saying shit all the time and everybody else is saying shit, it just kind of reflects poorly. And I get it, you want to throw in like one or two, cuss words in a movie to make it edgy or whatever, but I feel like if you're going to do that, just leave it to the bad guys. I think it made Supergirl, who we're going to talk about later, just sound very coarse and rough and not like a hero. Not like, he's kind of meant to be the big blue Boy Scout, very much like Captain America. So the whole language thing, this is the OG right here. So beyond that, I think Lois brings up something really cool that I think the movie covered really well, was Clark trusting everyone and believing in the good in people, while Lois questions everyone and everything, and she's always digging for that dirt as a journalist to like find out like who's lying and who can't be trusted and stuff like that. And that's why she constantly puts herself at risk in all of these stories. And I think that's what's key to a good Superman story. No matter if it's a movie, a TV show, or a video game, or what have you, there always has to be like a big mystery for them to solve. Even though Batman is heralded as the world's greatest detective, Superman and Lois are journalists, and they have mysteries to solve themselves. A key part of journalism, a lot of that aligns with a lot of the same investigative tactics that a good detective would have. So it's kind of an underrated skill where, Superman isn't branded as like the world's greatest detective or the world's greatest journalist or anything. And I just feel like it's a moniker that just has to cast Batman as number one at so many things so he can be comparable to other heroes, when you could just really be like, yeah, he's a good detective, like duh, and you could just prove it by showing it instead of just being like, oh yeah, he's the best, So, moving on, Ultraman being under precise control and allowed into the Fortress of Solitude with Lex. This would mean that Lex has absorbed Superman's fighting techniques and has basically trained, come up with all these combos and AI and, just been able to see like, oh, if I command, various henchmen, like Ultraman and the girl that was with him. I can't think of her name. The engineer, I think, who was handling the nanomachines. Um, he's able to say like 18B or whatever and just sort of command them to do different combos like he's playing Mortal Kombat or something, but like it's a chess game in his head, he's commanding them to different spots on the board essentially, and he already, either in his head or with like AI computing and stuff, he kind of already knows, where it's going to happen, and that sort of implies his genius. And that Lex, isn't powered or anything like that. He just happens to be a criminal mastermind, and someone who is very skilled with technology, which I think, pretty much every incarnation of Lex Luthor that I've seen has, accurately pulled that off. So, yeah, very obsessively, I would say that. Yeah, observing the fighting techniques to obsessively use it against him. Lex also being the modern tech billionaire, much like Jesse Eisenberg's version was, where it felt like a lot of Musk and Zuckerberg combined. The egos, the controlling senators, having senators in your pocket, and city leaders and newspapers and stuff like that, and having the press, like the guy who interviews him. I basically called him Tucker Carlson in my head. I was like, oh, that's Tucker, but I think that guy is actually a comedian. I'm just not familiar with him, and I couldn't think of his name off the top of my head here. But yeah, there's a mix of like Musk and Zuckerberg, and then there's like a little bit of Trump in there with the jealousy of like immigrants and seeing like a godlike alien immigrant, just automatically being assigned as a savior type of character, a modern messiah and such. And then this also leads into the part where he defames Superman's character, and this is another part of where it's not necessarily that like Superman's dumb, it's just that Lex is able to use things by his observation in order to, use his brain to equal himself with Superman's brawn, and so they sort of come par to par at that moment, which is very common in the comics. So it's not necessarily that one's like stupid and one's smart or whatever, but he's able to use the skills that he has to his advantage. And then also an interesting thing is Eve Tessmacher foiling Luthor's plans with selfies that she was sending to Jimmy throughout the whole movie. It's interesting to say, did she know that she was sending those images with the sensitive info in the background? Or is it just, she's just a dumb blonde taking selfies and she's not really realizing that she has all these government contracts and maps and all sorts of things in the background that incriminate Lex for lording over the Baravian government and essentially orchestrating the genocide of the Joranporians by the Baravians. So we'll get into that more as we go on here, but we'll go from there. So this was a question that I have that I think is very interesting, is that, Superman listens to his parents' message, his Kryptonian parents' message, and he remarks on how he really just has a small portion of the message that was not damaged. And Lex and his team are able to restore that message, but I think that it was potentially doctored, because I don't really like the idea. It doesn't seem consistent with Jor-El's character to say, be fruitful and multiply and, have multiple wives and, lord over the humans as they're a weak and primitive race, and that's why they sent him to Earth. I can't imagine like a father sending their baby, their only child, to a, even knowing that he would be stronger in Earth's yellow sun, but to do something like that and essentially make Clark be, or Kal-El rather, be General Zod. That doesn't seem consistent with how the House of El operates or would raise him. Like, Jor-El being, essentially a climate scientist, and seeing their planet go into turmoil due to those problems. Jor-El was not like Zod. He was not a general or someone trying to terraform Krypton on Earth, and that the humans should be destroyed. But I think it's manipulated because of what Lex essentially ends up admitting to, is that he causes the Boravian and Jarhanporian conflict, and essentially what I see is like they just didn't reveal that he was doctoring that, so that it would also create reason for people to fear and to hate Superman in the way that he does. But there's just no actual proof, and so Lex has to manufacture it, is what I think. But if I'm wrong, I think that would be a huge misunderstanding of the lore of Krypton. Um, let's see. Yeah. So talking about that, I also just, this kind of just broke me, and I get it because it's a James Gunn movie. He always kind of has Sean Gunn, uh, playing roles, and he's gonna have his now wife in various roles, and Peacemaker shows up for a cameo, which I thought was really funny. But I think Bradley Cooper as Jor-El was like a miscast. Like, I get it, he has the look when you give him the blue eyes and the beard, and you make him look very wise and fatherly. But I think one thing that we agreed on watching the movie was it looked like he was just reading, and it sounded like Italian to me off a teleprompter. I was like, it just sounds weird, and it just took me out of the movie. And also because his wife kind of looked like Lady Gaga. I didn't realize who it was. I didn't recognize the actress, but I was just like, this like doesn't, it detracts from the movie. Whereas like Russell Crowe as Jor-El was natural. Marlon Brando as Jor-El, like, for the time, it felt incredibly right, and it wasn't like a distraction from the entire movie. Where it's just like, you're like Adam Sandler casting all your buddies in every single film. It's like, well, it kind of pulls you back when you have a more, I don't even want to call this a serious movie because it's a comic book movie, but I feel like it's a little more serious than just like trying to, have strange cameos like that, and not really allow for character development, or to allow Bradley Cooper to be taken as seriously. Because it's just a cameo, it ends up being taken less seriously, and it comes across as like kind of an inside joke, and I think it ruins the stature of that character. So next, I want to talk about the Justice Gang, as they are called. We have Green Lantern Guy Gardner, of course, who's, this is like one of the rare opportunities that we've seen him in live action. He's hilarious. He's egocentric Green Lantern. Why they chose him over Jon Stewart or Hal Jordan, I don't know. We'll see. But I think it's just a creative decision, just to kind of go with like the douchiest of the Green Lanterns, and to give him, the chili bowl haircut that he often has in the comics. And I think Nathan Fillion was like good casting. Hawk Girl kind of ends up being the foil to Guy Gardner, and she's just kind of the serious character that, I would hope that they flesh her out more because her and Hawkman have like a really interesting and very tragic story. And so because this movie feels like it's the third movie in like a series of movies, it it doesn't do a good job of establishing and introducing characters. It kind of just assumes that you already know these characters, or that maybe you're going to go on TikTok or YouTube and look things up later, or go read comics, or go ask your friend who knows about all this stuff. So I mean, it ends up being kind of a like, not everyone's going to go seek out that knowledge. They're just going to be like, "Oh, who was that?" And I felt like because of that, her character could have been like easily replaced by anyone else, and it didn't feel like her presence there mattered. But it was really cool seeing her in the movie, and I think it was great. I just wish they had done more with it. Mr. Terrific, I think, was a great choice. We've obviously seen him in the CW verse, and if you've read like Kingdom Come, Justice, like some of these other, there's all sorts of comics that have him. But yeah, seeing him don the jacket, when he put the jacket on, I was like, that's it, dude, that's the one. And so he kind of felt like a character that was, not there for the drama or for anyone's BS. And so when he teams up with Lois and protects her with the T-spheres while also being a total badass and taking out all of Lex's henchmen, was a really awesome addition to the movie. And the Hall of Justice, one thing I would point out there is that it, as the movie hints, that metahumans have been around for hundreds of years, and that, it's been, tens of years that Superman's been around, I guess, and, they're hinting at other characters. So we do, one of the characters I spotted in the mural in the background. There's several, and I'm sure I'll pause it at some point and identify everyone. But I saw Wildcat, and I saw Jay Garrick's Flash, which I thought was really cool. I think that'll be interesting because, like, by establishing metahumans are everywhere, you sort of create a big playground where you can introduce more and more characters as the DCU grows. But that's also something that Snyder's universe had. Like, essentially, the whole Themysciran mixed in with the lanterns and the Greek gods and all these things happening at once. They kind of already had that in the past, but that Dark Side had pretty much taken out a lot of them. So there's that. But yeah, I think, overall the Justice Gang was cool and lighthearted and fun. But once again, it kind of comes back to play with the idea of, like, you can't really put the genie back in the bottle and have, like, a solo Superman movie after this, or have, it feels harder to have character development for him when you have to sort of mess around with everyone else. Now, Superman was trying to minimize and manage destruction and chaos while fighting giant aliens like the kaiju, who was sort of a distraction set up by Lex. And he was managing a team that doesn't listen to each other. They don't work together. They don't really respect him yet. They kind of just see him as another metahuman that's, like, very powerful, but also, he gets a lot of the spotlight because he's the big blue Boy Scout and he's got all the power. But I think it was really cool that they showcased how, the comics and the movies, as Man of Steel did, that there is a lot of destruction, and that even when Superman tries to minimize destruction, he's battling, godlike creatures and aliens and all sorts of things. So the scale is really high. Whereas Batman is just, sort of punching street level villains and stuff like that, typically. So I thought that was well handled, as I think all movies have done. And I think it's going to be interesting to see those people that were, like, heavily criticizing Man of Steel for all the destruction, when, like, that was, like, Superman's first real fight against General Zod, which is like an actual threat that is equal to him, and that's why Zod had to be handled in that way. And so very much with the events that happen in this movie, the scale is really high, and the destruction happens regardless of him trying to minimize it. So I mean that's something that the movie handles really well, and probably that a potential sequel will probably address that type of stuff as the world reacts to his presence. Now, moving on, I want to get into what I'm kind of waiting to like see what others think of this, because I think the a lot of the news stations like Fox News and stuff like this, and even Dean Cain, who was a former Superman actor in Lois and Clark back in the '90s, he said Superman's not an immigrant. And he seems to not remember that he played Superman in a scene where politicians and government officials were questioning his immigration status, and they were saying, "Hey, we're gonna have to ground you, Superman, because we don't even know where you're from, and you don't have your papers and all that stuff." So it's real weird that Dean Cain, being such a MAGA Trumper, doesn't remember the origins of a character that's always been, quote unquote woke. I mean, he's always, if you don't understand what woke means, it doesn't just necessarily mean, rainbow flags and liberal stuff. Like it's, woke means to be awake. So how some people talk about being sheep and stuff like that. Well, you're a sheep until you wake up and you realize the bigger issues around the world around you. So to be woke is to become awake and aware of issues. So it's actually not a bad thing. It's just a definition that has been corrupted over the years by right-wing propaganda. But I think what's interesting here is, Superman is the original immigrant. He's literally an alien from another planet who lands in Kansas and has to, he can't just tell people I'm an alien. He sort of has to blend in, and, in as Smallville, an episode of Smallville even highlights that he hides one of his friends who's, I believe he's like Mexican or something like that. And he says, we can't just let him be turned into the authorities. Like, he deserves the same treatment that I got. I deserve to live here just as, Javier, or whatever his name was, if I remember right. I haven't seen it in a long time, but I mean, it's that his story has always been an immigrant story, which if you look at it right, if you're not a Native American, if you're not someone that was here, if your family history doesn't go back to those moments, that means you immigrated here, whether it's from Germany or England or Spain or Italy or France or you come from an Arab country or something like that. Family history, whether it's 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 100 years ago, whether you're here legally or illegally, you are afforded humanitarian rights as not necessarily as an American citizen, but citizens do have their rights, but also so does anyone that's on American soil has basic rights. So you have a right to a fair trial. You have a right, you have all the rights to, that normal Americans would have in court, basically. So I think what's interesting is the whole immigration thing that's playing out right now, where Donald Trump is essentially jailing, pro-Palestinian protesters and Palestinians and Lebanese people, and he's also jailing a lot of the Hispanic population, and just claiming, oh, well, you're at your immigration hearing, you're following what is guaranteed to you as due process, whether you're seeking asylum, whether you're here, trying to go through the system the right way, you are afforded due process. And that's just what happens as being a citizen on this soil. So technically Superman, if Clark Kent were to reveal himself as Superman, as an immigrant, as an alien, he would be afforded due process. And people just can't seem to understand that. And they sort of look at him, it's like, oh, well, he's white. He must be American. He must be an original, right? And that's just not how the system works. So it's just really weird, the whole immigration thing. But I think it's a really good issue that the movie pulls in. And it doesn't feel like the movie is like overly or unjustly politicizing things, because the comics have always been political. Superman has beat up the Ku Klux Klan. He's beat up Nazis. Like, he's done all this stuff. Like, it's always been this way. He's never been a right-wing figure. He has stood against the police during the BLM protests. I mean, he literally, punched corrupt cops, and Fox News went nuts about it during the New 52. Some of the last couple issues were of the BLM sort of protests, and he stood there side by side with the people and marched with them, because he's always on the side of right. He's not always on the side of like what's good for America, and that's where we're going to leap into next. He's not like Captain America, and even Captain America is not a direct one-to-one, mascot for America. That's what they wanted him to be, but because of his morals and his upbringing and his duty to do right by people, whether they're from America or not, he sees wrongdoing anywhere in the world, he feels it's his duty to step up and stop it, which is why we idolize heroes like Cap and Superman and just most heroes in general, but especially these, is because they appeal to our better angels, what we wish we could be and what we should aspire to be. So characters like Superman and Cap, they're not boring. They're literally the original embodiment of what we aspire to be. Even our gods are based around these type of things, because let's not forget, Siegel and Schuster were Jews. Now, the Jewish religion doesn't consider Jesus to be anything more than just like a prophet or just a notable figure. They don't recognize Jesus as a Messiah. But even Superman is heralded by people all over the world as some sort of messianic figure. And Superman has always been depicted in Christ-like positions and has sacrificed himself multiple times in Man of Steel, and even this new Superman movie. He directly hands himself over to the government in the same way that Jesus hands himself over to Pontius Pilate, right? But, right-wingers don't like to compare anything to Jesus, and they wouldn't allow Jesus in this country because they would recognize him as an Arab, and they would turn him away. They would probably jail him or worse. So what I want to get to is one of the core conflicts at the heart of the movie, and that is this direct link to society, which is the Boravians and the Jarapurians, okay? And I think this is really interesting, because as soon as I saw where the countries were and the names, and then as soon as I started seeing more and more, I was like, oh my God, how is James Gunn doing this? How is he not even, it's not allegory where Superman is an allegory of Christ, for example. That's an allegory. But when you're directly, like, it's so obvious. It's not allegory when you are referencing the Israel and Palestinian genocide. So you have the Boravians, which are meant to sort of represent a little bit of a mix of Israel, but also there's a little bit of Russia in there, because they do sound Russian and they do have architecture that implies Russian. But you also have the guy with the deep voice like this who sounds like Benjamin Netanyahu. And he has like the gray, like wiry, psychopathic, mad scientist hair. And the leader of Boravia, is very much like Benjamin Netanyahu mixed with Putin. And the commentary is directly linked to the Palestinian genocide. And it could easily be also interpreted as Russia invading and occupying the Ukraine. But I think when you get further in the movie and you see people dressed in more desert clothing attire, you see, oh my God, these are Arabs. These are, the The Jaremporians are essentially Palestinians, and the more we're going to get further into our discussion here on that, but one of the big obvious scenes that solidifies that is that you have full-on military, like battle dress soldiers and tanks that are rolling up to this fenced-in city like Gaza, and they're literally pointing their guns through the fence at civilians, men, women, and children who are also hoisting a handmade Superman flag, calling for Superman to come and save them. So they're not terrorists. And that's a direct reflection of what's happening in Gaza, is that people are being innocently killed. And you can find more information on this, Aaron Shack Politics, on my YouTube channel, Aaron Shack Politics. We cover a lot of Gaza and Palestine, the West Bank, what's going on there. But it is a direct reflection of what the Israeli occupation forces do and how they directly target hospitals, mosques, churches, even Christian churches have been bombed, hospitals, and they've dropped 2,000-pound bunker busters directly from America on these buildings, on hospitals, and it completely turns it into a crater. So there's no justification for that. There's no reason to harm innocent children either. And I've seen a lot of images of children with no limbs, and I've seen people's entire family trees, chunks of their family tree, or the entire family completely demolished in these bombings and these killings. And the reason why I point out the fencing is because recently, one of the things in the news is that they will funnel Palestinians into this fenced-in area in order to give them aid. And it's very reminiscent of concentration camps from Nazi Germany. And so they funnel them in these lines, and they're fenced in, and they have guards, and the guards shoot them as they get the aid. And they shoot them to also, control them and say, like, you need to leave, so we're just going to start killing you guys until you flee with whatever aid you manage to get. And it's kind of dog eat dog, right? And so that is deeply reminiscent of the scenes that we're seeing in this movie. So this movie isn't meant to be like propaganda or anything. It's meant to wake you up to the idea that we've had this genocide going on for 2 years, since 2023, October 7th. And granted, it's been happening before then, but this is the first time that it's been literally live streamed to your televisions, your phones, your TikTok, your YouTube, your Facebook, all that stuff, every single day. And our politicians are paid to send money over there. Our tax dollars are going over there. The city of San Marcos even discovered through their city council that some of their millions of dollars was going to Israel instead of to their city. And they were called anti-Semitic by Governor Abbott for saying, like, hey, we should worry about us first before we send money to a foreign country that's committing an act of genocide. And now we're complicit. So this movie wakes you up to that idea. And it can't be denied. It can't say, oh, well, it's just making a statement, or, oh, it's just a fictional universe with fictional characters. No. Media, whether it's Andor and the massacre that happens in Andor, which I want to make a video on as well, because that's a direct reflection of how imperial forces are the IDF, or the IOF, Israeli Occupation Forces, and how the people, not just the rebels, but also the people that are in that courtyard in season 2 of Andor are essentially the Palestinians just being massacred for living in their own land. And it's about resources. Okay, so moving on. This gets to a bigger point in the film, which is tying together all of our ideas, right? Superman intervenes in world conflicts, as he does in the comics, to do the right thing, not always the American way, because the American way is to send those bombs and support the Boravian government because they want the oil that the Jaremporians are sitting on, or any other metals or any sort of resources that they're sitting on, in the same way that we use Israel as quote-unquote the only democracy in the Middle East, even though it's more of an authoritarian ethno-state. And an ethno-state is where you decide that only one people run religion, whether it's white, Jewish, Zionists, are allowed to live in that area, and anyone else, Christians, Arabs, Palestinians, Muslims, etc. No one else is allowed to live there. And, by doing so, you cause an ethnic cleansing, a genocide. You murder people, you push them out to the sea, you force them to leave, and you wall them off in a city where even if they wanted to leave, they can't leave. And the only thing that faces them is outright extinction. So, I mean, that is why this movie is so freaking important and why I love it even more than I thought I could imagine that I would enjoy this movie. So I was trying to come in as unbiased as I could because I was like, man, I really liked what they were doing with Henry Cavill, and Zack Snyder's Justice League really opened up some possibilities that I'd like to see in the future. But at the same time, I think this is a great first step for Superman, and I can't wait to see what he ends up doing next. So he doesn't always align with the American way, and a large part of the movie is the government and news sources and Lex Luthor taking advantage of the situation of everyone questioning, like, well, should we have this guy who's from America, but he says he doesn't represent America, but he goes against our interests in the Middle East, essentially? So, and he brings it up to Lois in the interview. He says, I went there because it was the right thing to do. Like, should those kids have died? Did those people deserve to die at the hands of the Baravians? And that's the question we face every day in America. Do those Palestinians deserve to die just based on where they live or what they think or what they believe? Just because we want to establish a foothold for Jewish pedophiles to shelter themselves in Israel? I have a video on that on my politics channel as well, where much like the Roman Catholic Church shelters their priests who are pedophiles against little children, and they move them to other churches or move them around the world. What happens in Jewish synagogues in the United States, other countries, these guys can be pedophiles, and then when they're about to be caught, Israel will shelter them, and the police, the IDF, none of these forces will prosecute them. They'll just, they just vanish. And there's no accountability because the United States isn't going to do anything. Israel's not going to do anything about it. So they're protecting pedophiles. An evil country full of evil people. So Lois questions him and his choices, as any good journalist should. And that leads, to conflict. And that really shows that, while Superman has this good heart, he hasn't thought of like the bigger implications that Lois is sort of opening his mind to, is like, well, how are you going to be this world police? Who decides what's right and wrong, And granted, he has a good moral compass of what's right and wrong, as Superman always has. But, at some point push comes to shove and the American government doesn't agree with what he's doing. What happens then? Well, it's the events of this movie. So eventually Metamorpho is blackmailed to create kryptonite to imprison Superman in a pocket dimension, which they literally just introduce in like one sentence, which for newer viewers is probably quite jarring. But honestly, it's just more DC deep lore that, it feels like, once again, we're just deep in like a third movie of a franchise that we've been watching for years, and so it does create that idea that we've skipped some stuff, but at the same time it feels welcome in a genre that is so oversaturated with the same old stuff that this is actually a huge breath of fresh air. And I can't even think of like a good superhero movie, other than like, maybe Justice League, like Zack Snyder's Justice League, like 5 years ago or so, whenever that was, 4 or 5 years ago. Like, even Marvel, I don't think they've innovated or created a good and powerful standalone movie like this since like Doctor Strange or Iron Man or Thor, like some of those movies where they really stood on their own 2 feet, and they weren't about leading into a universe or just being a stepstone movie of going from one step to the next, to the next, to the next. Like, I feel like this is a movie that you can very much just sit down and watch and be like, damn, that's a good time. I'll rewatch it again next year, like, or whenever, right? And it doesn't feel like comic book movies are that way anymore. And so this one to me feels like a breath of fresh air. Um, so one thing that we noticed was Metamorpho had a baby, right? And the baby didn't really look like Metamorpho. So there's some theories going around here that he could be Martian Manhunter. I'm not really sure because I don't know. It just doesn't. It could be true. I wouldn't be surprised because it's kind of another way that they could rush the plot along or something. Like maybe it really is his son, or maybe he just adopted him and he ends up being like the last survivor of Mars or whatever. But I would actually like them to take the time to just, whether it's in a Justice League movie, just sort of quickly gloss over the origins of Martian Manhunter as they usually do. And I mean, he showed up and was really great in Zack Snyder's Justice League, and I also think he was really great in Supergirl as well. I kind of wish he got more proper screen time, but it was really cool. So I don't know that theory. I'm just we just need more. We just need more. We'll analyze that, but I think it's a good question because it would be really cool for that to all work out. And then Metamorpho sort of joins the team as he aids in Superman's escape whenever the falafel guy is murdered. That sort of wakes Metamorpho up to this idea of, wow, this is my one chance for redemption. This is my chance to escape. Is to aid Superman in this rather than to be the source of his imprisonment. Next, I mean, just a brief comment. I think Jonathan and Martha Kent were really funny and, just like classic old people. It kind of, once again, it kind of skips to the era of like, we're already deep in the comics. Like, we're already deep in this universe. So, Jonathan and Martha are already like old boomer seniors, they're just 60s and 70s, can't hear, can't, and they genuinely love their son. They care about him more than the world, and they instantly welcome Lois into their home. And, those were some of the cutest, like, happiest scenes. And I think I think Jonathan and Martha Kent casting has always been on point, and I think the development of the characters has always been really good. So I've always enjoyed that. I think we already hit this. The kids hoisting the homemade Superman flag, desert people unarmed being shot by military and tanks, equivalent of the genocide of Palestinians, and Superman has to make a choice in that moment. He wants to go and help the Jarimporians because he knows, this is a moment where they're going to be massacred. But that is also at the same time where Lex decides to pretty much let the pocket dimension that is sort of starting to overflow into the real world and essentially create a black hole and start erasing the Earth. He just decides it's scorched earth now. Like if the world chose Superman, then fine. Here's what comes with it. Lex was like, it, if I can't play with the toys, then nobody can. Like that type of thing, that type of playground attitude, I guess. And it really shows his hate and his narcissism and his jealousy of Superman, that he would, even as his reputation is being destroyed, by the proof that's been found by the Daily Planet, and, as Superman unmasks him as well in front of the world, he just doesn't care anymore and just goes full scorched earth. And so Superman has really prioritized that, like, I'm really the only one that can stop Lex and all his goons and all everything that's going on, and he allows the Justice Gang to go and save the Jarimporians. And it was kind of a cool, like, surprise moment where Guy Gardner shows up to save the little kid, and they start handling what is essentially the Israel occupation forces, and you get to see that type of oppression that that our better angels shouldn't allow us to stand for. So yeah, very, very intentional choice there. Daily Planet uses Eve's photos with sensitive information on Lex to expose him. Write the article, Mr. Terrific's. Yeah, and his little ship, that was really cool. To foil Lex's plans. Now, one of the interesting things is that Ultraman, as we talked about earlier, is revealed in the film, and he's not wearing his traditional outfit, as comic book fans would know. He's just sort of wearing an all-black outfit. And I think that's a really good way to keep it kind of a secret here. And I think that was a good twist. I think that's going to catch a lot of people off guard of like, oh, that's how Lex got in. And so what that brings up is, it brings up the idea of, was Ultraman Bizarro the whole time? Because he needed to be... Bizarro is notably, kind of sort of a backwards, like, zombie version of Superman. He kind of talks stupid like the Hulk, He talks about himself in third person. He uses incomplete sentences and like one word. It feels like every few words is like a sentence, like, me go here, or whatever. So, he needs to be relayed the fight plan and all the moves by Lex and commanded. And so when that speaker and the drones that monitor him are destroyed, that all of a sudden it becomes a fair fight. And Superman is allowed to take him out. So I think the question is he Bizarro? I don't think so. I think he's Ultraman. But I do think him at the end of the movie being thrown into the black hole could bring about the circumstances in which, Bizarro is typically like kind of an alternate universe type of Superman where everything's kind of backwards. The S is backwards. Instead of being the savior of humanity, he's the doom of humanity. He's the bane of it. And he's sort of, the bright blue-eyed zombie version of Superman. So I think that would make more sense because it seems like kind of even more of a rush to introduce Bizarro in a movie that's already jam-packed full of like heroes and villains and lore and just really throwing you in the center of it. But granted, in a pretty effective way. I think Krypto's beatdown on Lex was very hilarious. I think it was really cool the way Krypto was utilized. Superman whistles for him, and then Krypto takes out all the flying drones because they look like tennis balls, and dog fetch ball. But he also pounces on the speaker, which, destroys Ultraman's communication system. I think another thing to point out is that I think Nicholas Hoult did a really good job. Brilliant acting moment where you see Lex and his envy of Superman turn into just pure villainous hatred as he gets outed in the news all over the world. I mean, I think Nicholas Hoult really did a good job. I hadn't really seen him in anything before, so I was kind of like, okay, we'll just see. Like I haven't seen David in a whole lot of stuff other than Twisters, and that was like a completely different character. Sort of a nerdy guy who doesn't really care about people, but then going to this version of kind of someone who really does care about people. So much so. So I want to sort of, as we get to the end of the movie and sort of wrap up my thoughts here, I think the Supergirl cameo at the end was cool. I was surprised. I think it was effectively used. But I think I have a problem with the introduction. I know that they're supposed to be basing her storyline of her movie, I believe, off of Woman of Tomorrow, which might be okay, but I think in the movie she was portrayed as like immature and a drunk and cussing and a party girl, and it just felt like after seeing like how she behaves in the comics and Melissa Benoist's version of Supergirl in the CW, like, she's smart, she's resourceful, she's a journalist, she can handle everything on her own just as effectively as Superman does. I do think she has a really cool suit, which I'll actually bring up a little image here. Yeah, not bad. I don't get the jacket because usually no one wears jackets when they go to the fortress, but And I'm not really familiar with Millie Alcock's acting. Not really super familiar with her stuff, so I don't really have much I can say about that. But once again, yeah, just want to say Nicholas Hoult did a really good job. He looked the part. He had the anger. He had the brains. He had, sort of the snarky and suave behavior that we can see here as he's like sipping the cup and saying things. Okay, maybe it does have a bit of a, yeah, I see that like tinge of purple, but it's honestly more of a black. But yeah, I think that tie is definitely a subtle tinge of purple. But yeah, once again, just another chance to look at those accents. But once again, it just that material and that padding sort of covers up all those muscles that he works so hard to form. Unfortunately, and the Kingdom Come S on the back. Eve mentions that Lex has access to most and all cameras in Metropolis because he spies on people, like his girlfriends that he's previously locked up. So I think this, this is a thought that we have here, is that this could be a way that Lex learns of Lois and Superman's relationship with their kiss inside the Daily Planet, or her work colleagues know that she's making out with Superman, but do they know that she's been dating Clark as well? And thus, do they know that he's Superman? That was kind of a weird, like, unclear thing that the movie didn't really flesh that part out. It was kind of a throwaway, like, humorous line. Does that put them at risk? But I also think Lex probably just knows, because I think they've probably tangoed more than once. I think they've probably interacted, more than just this time in this movie. Or there might be, he's been doing recon long enough that he knows, he just needed to know where Superman goes in order to, maybe he's found a way to extract his DNA, because essentially he created Ultraman from a DNA sample of Superman, so that implies that he's fought something in the past. So, and that could even be the Baravian guy at the beginning of the movie. That could have been an opportunity. He could have used previous fights then to stage that. And now, does Lex being exposed still allow him access to those cameras? I think he'd already be in jail, but it's also possible. I feel like he's gonna get broken out. Like, as soon as I saw him go in that Humvee, I was like, oh, he's probably gonna like blackmail the people in the Humvee to let him go, or somehow, he'll stage a prison break. There's also a Gotham sign inside of a road sign as people are evacuating Metropolis. So there's definitely some world building. Of course, the brands used in DC Comics, like the sodas and the billboards and stuff like that. There's already a lot of like really good world building, I think, and most Superman movies tend to hint at various things like LexCorp, or they hint at different sports teams from Smallville or Metropolis, or they hint at like Wayne Tech satellites and things like that. So I think the world building is doing really good, and I think overall the movie showcased a lot of what Superman is all about. Right? It showcased his love for people, his trustworthiness, and his willingness to do the right thing. All his powers, from the super breath, the frost breath, the laser eyes. They didn't really show X-ray vision, but and the flight, of course, and it had some moments with the big punches and when he went nuts and spun around with the laser eyes. It definitely goes more into stuff that we've seen more often in the comics, of sort of those like silly moments where he does something that sort of combines elements of like chemistry and physics in order to find creative ways to dispatch of his enemies, and he just quickly takes out all of Lex's like robotic henchmen quickly and easily. So I think overall, like like I said, I think I really enjoyed the movie, and that's why I wanted to sort of come through here and give you all like a, an analysis of, you know, what I think of it. And I think they got a lot of the things right, especially the costuming, always having her in her purple outfits. That seems to imply the duality of red and blue makes purple. Um, it sort of implies that there's this mix, that these two merge really well despite being different, when they are combined. They are this incredible duo, and I think the romance is essential. I think every good Superman movie tends to have, something like that. You got to have a little bit of the romantic flight type moments. So I think all in all, I really enjoyed the movie. I wasn't sure if I was going to, um, but I'm quite glad I did, and I think some of the huge things are I think the fact that they got the character right, the setting, and they pulled us into a story that was already on the move, but granted, they did it effectively, and they introduced a lot of core Superman heroes and villains and, Justice League members and such, that's crafting a bigger world. I think there's a few missteps here and there, as I've explained, but I think, they got the immigrant part right. They got the, obviously the hugest part of the movie, I think, is the Baravians and the Jar Emporians, plot line that really threads this into modern day society. And I feel like if you're mad about that, it's because you're also mad that he beats up the Klan and he beats up Nazis, and you don't like your side being questioned or being wrong, essentially, because there's really only one right side when there's a genocide. There's only one correct party in that. Okay, and it wasn't the Nazis, it wasn't the Germans, it wasn't the modern day Zionists that are murdering Palestinians over land that they have no right to and that they don't own and that they just came into after World War II and took over with no reason and no permission to do so, because it was not the British's land to hand over to the Israelis. So that's where we stand. So I want to do, I'm going to flip through the comments here and see what you guys think. If you have any questions, concerns, we'll get into it. But yeah, really enjoyed it, man. Really enjoyed the figurines. Yeah. There are Christian and Catholic churches in Palestine and in Gaza. One of the last Catholic churches in the area is still holding mass every Sunday somehow. So yeah, I mean, the Zionist Israelis, they don't like anyone. If you're not on board with the Zionist agenda, they don't like you. They call you a self-hating Jew, or they, if you're a Christian evangelical, that they usually tend to align with the Zionist propaganda, because they seem to believe that Israel is people chosen by God, and these are not the same people. They're not the Israelites. Those people are the Palestinians. Those are the people with those genetic lineages and the heritage to the land. Those are the people that never left. The Ashkenazis are Jews from Europe. Those are different people. And some of those people, their Zionists, aren't even practicing Jews, but that's besides the question. So it's not about Jews versus, it's not about religion. It's about political agendas of Zionists who use the Jewish religion as an excuse, and they twist everything to be anti-Semitic so that, they are beyond criticism, right? Yeah, Ultraman, let me see if I can pull up an image here. Yeah. So you're familiar with this Ultraman from Japan. Let me sorry, I switched things around so I could have that slideshow ready, and I didn't have to mess with things. Yeah, see, you're familiar with like this Ultraman, but there's also the Ultraman from DC Comics. So, like, there's the one that you saw in the movie. Here, damn it, it's still not showing up. Hang on. Right here. Okay. So yeah, there's the Ultraman here on the left that you see in the movie that's like not in his traditional uniform, but like the Ultraman from the comics essentially looks like Superman, but he has like a big U on his chest, and essentially it's usually sort of a different form of the Justice League that ends up essentially they all end up being a bunch of criminals essentially. Like they're all bad guys, but they're like metahuman bad guys. Yeah, I actually think yeah, Crisis on Two Earths gets into it. I think there's some episodes of like Batman Brave and the Bold that get into it as well. Yeah, this is the DC Comics Ultraman. So yeah, this is no, it's WB and DC. Yeah, DC Comics, long time character, been around for a long time. But yeah, that's him. But in the movie, they kind of kept him hidden. You know, they put a mask on him. You know, they put him in all black, so that way they could sort of like fool like the new viewers. I'm not sure if I like the new Supergirl that was in the movie. Like I said, I kind of have some problems. Um, yeah, I couldn't find a lot of good pictures of her. You know, a lot of these are like AI trash. But yeah, I don't like the way that she was like very crude and cussing and a drunk and all that. I think Melissa Benoist's depiction of the character was much better. Arrowverse cameos, not that I've seen, but I think they're very much wanting to separate these universes, as far as I know. Any other questions, concerns, any thoughts? I mean, what did you guys think of the movie? Like, did you love it? Did you hate it? Have you seen it? Are you excited to see it soon? Because I do recommend it. If you have or haven't seen it, I think it's recommended. I really enjoyed it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Ultraman is usually he's usually easily compared to Superman. Like a lot of people confuse him because like in the comics they're like people don't notice the U unless you're up close, you know, and so they don't realize he's a bad guy until it's too late because he looks so similar. But hell yeah, man, great episode. I'm glad I was able to kind of like sum some things up a little bit, but I'm interested in seeing where things go from here, and I think overall it was a good movie, and I can't wait to watch it at home and pause a few moments, catch some details, pick it up on Blu-ray. Super cinematic. Yeah, I could see that. Surprised your favorite DC character showed up. Which one's that? Supergirl. Okay, I should have clocked that. Yeah, with the Captain Marvel fan. Yeah, that makes sense. No, she's great. I like Supergirl. I read a lot of her comics. I don't think I've found a figurine of her, but if you want to prepare for her movie, then yeah, you need to check this out right here. Supergirl, Woman of Tomorrow, and you can get it as a well. That picture is very tiny. Yeah, right there. Supergirl, Woman of Tomorrow. You can get the graphic novel of that. I think James Gunn has mentioned that that's kind of where he wants to take the character. So we'll see. Just a lot of like AI fan art of these characters, like people just trying to imagine how it works or fake it. I don't know. Very weird to me. But we'll kind of see how it works. But yeah, overall, very positive thoughts. Positive thoughts. Yeah, man, Supergirl next year. I mean, assuming everything runs according to plan, yeah, I think that's where we'll be. And I'm curious to see Jason Momoa as Lobo. I'm kind of surprised that they didn't like tease him in perhaps Superman as a future villain or anything. But I just hope he has a lot of projects like pending, and I just sort of hope that he doesn't take so long to make another movie. Like I know Supergirl will probably feel like another Superman movie, and maybe Superman will show up, but I feel like if he has to be the one directing and writing the whole universe, it's going to take a long time before we get to a Superman sequel, which is a problem that I had with Man of Steel. Was like I really wanted a follow-up, and we never got it, essentially. But yeah, I do think Henry Cavill is my favorite. But I think David Cornsweet did a really good job. And I don't know. I just feel like we were robbed. But I do really like the movie, and I appreciate what he brought to it. I think he did good. What's up? We're just talking about some of our last thoughts here on the Superman movie, but we're just kind of getting in any last questions or thoughts or what you thought of the movie if you've seen it. But yeah, we'll begin to wrap up this episode of the podcast. Don't forget that you can get the Half HP shirt in the merch store. We got links in the description down below. Of course, you can see the YouTube product shop has this shirt as well as other shirts in all different colors. Also has a QR code on the side that'll take you to my website. And yeah, I caught Superman opening day, I guess. I didn't catch it the night before. I was just like, let's just go see it in the afternoon, early evening, the day of. And so got to see it, had a lot of thoughts about it. But yeah, as we're like an hour and a half in here, I think that's probably a good place to begin to wrap things up, and where we'll be able to sum it all up there. This is really cool. Yeah, because it came out, I think, Friday, technically. So, yeah, I caught it on Friday, on the 11th. It was good. I love it. But yeah, just, rewind this video if you want to catch what happens next. It's a promising start for the DC Universe. If you haven't seen Creature Commandos, technically that animated show leads into Superman. It has some events that happened before. Nothing that I think is like super pressing other than Rick Flag Sr. Like it just sort of gets into his character and the people that surround him. So I don't know. But I think it's a really good start. I really enjoyed what Zack Snyder was doing, and I think we just needed to let him cook and just, he was slowly building a universe, whereas here, it feels like this first movie is like, we're already in the universe. Like, it's just, it's throwing you in the deep end, and you're like, okay, you better start swimming. You better keep up, So I don't know. We'll see. I just want to see more of these characters and of Superman, and it feels like it might be a while. But nevertheless, maybe we can be excited for the Supergirl movie and go from there. And maybe at some point, we'll bring in some of the more niche characters and bring in Justice League, Justice Society, whatever, throw it all together and go from there. All right, I think we'll wrap it up there, everyone. But I want to thank you all for being here. I hope you all enjoyed this glimpse, review, and kind of a deep dive as well into the Superman movie from 2025. And just once again saying I'm kind of surprised. I really liked it. And if you want to know why, there's an hour and a half of plenty of reasons why. You can also catch this anywhere you get your podcasts in audio format. You can catch us on video format on YouTube. I don't know. We might do some games later tonight. I'm not sure. I might just need some time to rest. I've done a busy day of prepping for the podcast, and also we got a bunch of videos out, a bunch of clips and stuff that I've got uploaded and scheduled for YouTube Shorts and TikToks and all that, and kind of figuring out what we're going to do this week. And so one big announcement I want to make for this week, we're going to play some Superman video games this week. So I have a bunch of retro games, but I know I have some Superman ones that I wanted to pick up and play some more. And I feel what better time than when a Superman movie is out for us to load up some classic Superman video games and start playing. So until next time, take care, be safe, have a good night, and we'll see you on the next one. This has been Shackcast episode 72. Bye.